Well, there are two elements to it. The first element is the ongoing trade increase, the increase which we have seen. In fact, the trade has ballooned to over $65 billion. It was just around $30 billion before 2022. What happened in 2022 was that in that year, the war in Ukraine started and India started to import Russian energy in a major way. Now, of course, that helps India's growing economy. It's important for India to have cheap sources of energy, and the trade became almost $65 billion that it stands currently. Now, the flip side to it is that it led to increase in trade deficit, especially for the Indian side, because while India was importing from Russia, Russia wasn't importing much from India. Now, during this visit, the push is that the Russian side imports from India, especially agriculture products. Given the fact that India is a major agriculture country, it produces a lot of vegetables, fruits, and it wants new markets. Now, in this aspect, the second element comes. That is that India is effectively turned off from a major market, that is the American market, primarily because of Donald Trump's tariffs. The tariffs that have been imposed roughly at 50% because India has been importing Russian energy. Now, India needs new market for its agriculture produce, and Russia can be that big market. So clearly there is a win-win in terms of trade. Both sides are hoping that the trade reaches to $100 billion US in matter of few years. The rough estimate is by 2029, 2030, and that won't be tough in 4 years' time given the trajectory of the trade between the two countries. So the trade remains an important element. In fact, it will be the dominating element of the talks between the Russian president and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi when they sit together for the bilateral talks tomorrow here in New Delhi, even though they are going to have the informal talks, the private dinner in a short while from now.
Our Assistant Editor for Foreign Affairs is Siddhant Subal. He's in New Delhi. Susan Tehrani is our correspondent. She's in New York, and the world over is watching this trip by the Russian president to India because it's quite significant. They've put aside the war. They're now talking about the oil, the petrol, and everything to do with trade. Susan, what are Americans saying? Because I know they're watching with bated breath as to what will be agreed between the Indian Prime Minister and also the Russian president.
Yeah, it really does come at a significant time, this visit. And I was just reading some online, observations, and it says that Prime Minister Modi breaking protocol clearly shows that no amount of U.S. tariffs or Western pressure will make him come down from his status stance. And that stance is not only regarding tariffs, but it's also about India's relations with other countries. And I think that for the most part, the Americans are watching right now, not only to see this relationship between India and Russia, personally, Putin and Modi, but also, how it's going to pan out when it comes not only to the issue of defense, purchasing of more Russian oil on the part of India, the tariffs here, the issue of H-1B immigration, but defense is, as I mentioned, is just also extremely important, and people-to-people dialogue. So the optics are going to be very important, but what comes out of this visit is going to be important at a very critical time when the United States is trying to work with Russia and Ukraine to put an end to Russia's war in Ukraine. So I think that aspect of it, while it often gets overlooked, I think India's role in that is going to be very important as well.
You're right, because the outcome is actually the main sticking point here, because it's a cautious strengthening of existing ties between New Delhi and Moscow. India could secure firm timelines on defense deliveries, maintenance contracts, and technology upgrades for aircraft, tanks, and submarines. And Trump has been doing the same with other countries, and not India, for instance. Do you actually think that Trump may comment after this, this whole trip is over, and then we see some deliveries being made, which include aircraft and the tanks and the submarines to India from Russia? What do you think the president may say or do about that?
Yeah, I think it may be too soon to tell, considering President Trump's nature of keeping things unexpected. But it's very likely that he is going to talk about his relationship personally with Prime Minister Modi, which he often hails and talks about in great length and with great pride. But he is going to be, I think, He's going to be talking about the issue of tariffs and oil, and India is going to be in that equation, and of course Russia as well. But remember, this is a very significant time because it also comes at a time when we're hearing reports that Russia and the United States are hoping to open up business once again as well. For example, McDonald's got its licensing back in Russia. It wants to launch, but also a lot of issues on the table when it comes to chip making, rare earth mineral, and whatnot. So I think this might be beneficial, actually, this relationship between India and Russia, not necessarily regarding the oil part of it, but other aspect of it. And it might sort of be beneficial to the United States as well. So Russia is also in a very peculiar situation right now here because it's dealing with the United States on the one hand. It's telling the United States that, Russia can be open for business if we can get this deal with Ukraine through and the sanctions don't get imposed, or at least more sanctions. But it's also, working with India, showing that, it has very close ties with India. It can be a reliable partner for India at a time when other countries, notably the West and perhaps the United States in many cases, have not been that reliable. So, a very fascinating dynamic to watch nonetheless.
I like what Susan said there. It could be a very peculiar situation for Russia. But what about India? Because if India and Russia agree on joint production of defense equipment and Indian investment in Russian oil and gas projects, what would that mean to the Western world? What would that mean to the United States of America, for instance? Doesn't it put India in a very precarious situation?
Well, gone are the world when the American side used to basically dictate countries. That world is long over. Unfortunately, Donald Trump hasn't realized that. The fact that Donald Trump has imposed tariffs on India is a red line breached. The commentary by his officials are not taken well. It is basically a violation of how things work, especially in Asia. India is a growing economy. It's one of the largest economies, the most populated country on the planet. And yet the American side chose to disrespect India. Now, this thing hasn't gone well in India. On the contrary, the Russian side has understood the Asian psyche, not only accorded the respect, but also increased their engagement with Asian giants like India and China. Now, when it comes to India's investments abroad, yes, there are, of course, obvious worries, especially on sanctions, especially engaging with entities who are sanctioned as well. We know that India does not import energy from Iran because of Donald Trump's the concerns over the sanctions. But can Donald Trump continue to veto the country's choices, whether India imports from Russia, whether India imports from Venezuela? You've already closed two sources, that's the Iranian and the Venezuelan. You want to close the Russian source. You want India to just buy the American oil. That is not going to happen in real world. India is going to increase its import of the American energy for sure. India will be decreasing or increasing depending on the international market when it comes to sourcing from Russia. But when it comes to India's trade, when it comes to India's imports, when it comes to India's investments abroad, this is something that India is going to take its own decision, and any commentary by the American side will not be taken very kindly.
That is our Assistant Editor for Foreign Affairs, Siddhan Subal. He's in New Delhi. And joining us on the newsroom, or in the newsroom, is my colleague, Mohammed Saleh. Mohammed Saleh, the official state visit has begun for the Russian President Vladimir Putin in India. Quite a spectacular show there of camaraderie and also brotherliness and friendship. Even them, both of them, traveling in the same car. Quite a significant or diplomatic move there by the Indian Prime Minister.
That is exactly correct, Eric. The optics of what we've just witnessed just goes on to highlight as to how strong the India-Russia equation has been. not just at this moment, but in fact over the course of the last 7+ decades. The fact that at this moment, Vladimir Putin is in New Delhi, and we saw him shoulder to shoulder with our Prime Minister Narendra Modi there. It just goes on to show as to how the India-Russia equation has been evolving. And I just heard you talk to my other colleagues there about how this is a pretty interesting moment in global geopolitics, about how India is doing a very interesting balancing act. Remember, Russia is a tried and tested partner. For the last 7 decades, Russia has always been there whenever India has needed its military hardware. 60 to 70% of India's military hardware still comes from Russia. The United States of America is an interesting bit of a puzzle in terms of how India pursues its policy. Remember, the United States has been trying for the last many decades. It's not just Donald Trump, even before, to try and see if India would sit in one of the camps. But India has been clear with its foreign policy. During the time of Nehru, it was the policy of non-alignment. Currently, we call this policy of strategic autonomy. That means India will do business with any nation that it sees fit, and India pursues its own foreign policy interests. And this would be, Washington would do well to understand that India cannot be bullied, India cannot be browbeaten, and India will pursue its interests, will make its own friends, and will do business with the nations with which it sees will actually serve India's foreign policy. What we are witnessing at this moment with Vladimir Putin in India at the moment is that the India-Russia equation is, of course, going to get stronger. At the same time, India also wants to do business with the United States of America, but it will do so on its terms.
Well, indeed, that's very true, because India faces continuous U.S. pressure regarding its Russian oil purchases. We were also disappointed not to see the Senate, which is the Russian limousine. We expected the Russian president to come with the Senate, but we did not see it. But that aside, the visit occurs at a very complex time. That is my colleague, Mohammed Saleh. You are watching WION World is One. The Russian state visit, the Russian president state visit to India has already begun. Tomorrow, he has a very long day ahead of him. So make sure you watch all the details and watch what happens and all their bilaterals, all their discussions between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, and also the 23rd Russia-India summit that will take place tomorrow. And also the Russian president meeting the President of India.